Hello and welcome to this all new episode of In Session Bennington to Montpelier. I am your host, Jack Rossiter Munley, coming to you from the Bennington County Multicultural Community Center here in beautiful downtown Bennington. And I am thrilled to be joined this morning by Senators Seth Bongartz and Rob Plunkett and Representatives Mary Morrissey and David Durfee. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the show.
Morning, Jack.
Hi, Jack. Good morning.
Excellent. I would like to get us underway with a bit of a continuation of some of what we discussed last week with regards to crossover. So on March 13th was the overall crossover for bills between the House and the Senate. And then this past, really yesterday, on Friday, was the crossover for money bills. And so Representative Durfee and Senator Plunkett, you were able to update us on the work of your committees and what that looked like going into crossover. I want to start by giving Representative Morrissey and Senator Bongartz the same opportunity for their committees, and then we'll talk in more depth with all of us about education in particular, but want to make sure that we get a chance to hear about where the work of those committees has landed and how it's looking coming into crossover. And let's start with you, Representative Morrissey.
Well, now you are referencing out of my committee, which I serve on institutions and corrections, but we do the capital bill, which is one of the money bills. And we've been working very hard to finish up our House version of it. Senator Plunkett also serves on Senate institutions and corrections. And so, they have, obviously their bill as well. And that's where we look to next week. It appears as though the beginning of the week we will be voting out our bill and with all the testimony we took and the updates of where projects are in the state. Ours should be coming out, hopefully be voting out by Tuesday or Wednesday. I know the appropriations bill, my understanding, will be debated on the House floor, at least on our side of the in the House, will be, I believe, debated Thursday and Friday next week. And Transportation did get their bill out this week. It's in appropriations and being reviewed. And so, that part is coming into play. And it's always a mix of the different, the Senate side and the House side. And that's why there's usually conference committees that come up to join the two and work out what, the overall end result bill will be. So yes, as the money bills start rolling out to the finish line, that's where you start to see the end of the session, coming up. And, they're saying the next couple or 8 weeks or more, but we will see, I guess.
You mentioned in terms of the money bill that will come out of your committee, some of these statewide projects. What are a few of those statewide projects to give people a little bit of a sense of where that corrections and institutions bill landed?
Well, we, locally, we've got, obviously the Bennington Monument is, has been just, is discussed, and there is money in place to be continuing on, but we are trying to get us to a point of knowing exactly what, the plan hopefully will be. Not hopefully, that when I say hopefully, I mean that will be going forward, but you have many different important projects around the state that, some have been long-standing, some shorter, but the needs are great. And so you have to be, very careful in moving the projects along appropriately to get so that the needs that we have in the state are hopefully fulfilled. We also have not only, like the monument, there's the Vermont Veterans Home, and there's a number of projects continuing on within that facility. We have correctional facilities that are in need of maintenance, as well as some new thoughts on, not thoughts, but trying to determine, even with corrections, what the future will look like in the state as far as our correctional facilities. And there's a lot. Rob would agree with me. You would be amazed what we discuss in our committee. Anything from parks and our parks and recreation agency, our natural resources, our military, our general buildings that the state owns across the state. It is a multitude of financial issues that we deal with, and trying to do the very best with many opinions by our members of the committee, like Rob's committee on his side. That's where we then come together to iron it all out. But there are across the board many projects that affect many groups within the state.
Excellent. And we'll definitely be watching that conference committee and sort of eventual resolution process around this very closely. And I'm sure we'll discuss it quite a few more times on further episodes of the show. Coming over to you, Senator Bongartz, for your committees, the Senate sits on, as a senator, you sit on more than one committee. So for your committees coming into the crossover period and looking at the path forward through some of the conference committees, give us a little bit of an update on what kinds of testimony your committee's heard, on what sorts of bills you're putting forward for the crossover.
So the in the Natural Resources Committee, which is my morning committee, we actually got a number of bills out over the course of the first half of the session, dealing with things like salt reduction, a bill that I introduced along with Senator Watson to put together a study on lake health in Vermont. And that passed the Senate and is now going over to, I just actually did the bill introduction over in the House Natural Resources Committee. I forget what day, one day this week. And we passed, and the thing we focused on the most, I think, is when we passed the big Act 250 bill, 181 last year, it had a lot of moving pieces, and when you pass a bill that big, it's always going to need tweaks. And so we had testimony from the business community and the environmental community, from the new board, the Land Use Review Board, administration, et cetera. And basically what we did was extended some of the deadlines. We extended the period of time when the exemptions from Act 250 for sort of the existing structure for downtowns until 2030 to make it easier to build housing in downtowns. And then by that time, the map and the new version, which kind of does the same thing, but we'll do it a little bit more carefully and in more detail, will be up and running. And so the one will just flip into the other. And we extended the basic timeframes, mostly based on testimony from the environmental, from the Land Use Review Board about the amount of time they needed to get through the sort of thinking it through part and then the rulemaking process for things like the new Tier 3 and the road rule. So good bit of work, and that'll be on the floor this week. And in the Education Committee, we passed out a handful of smaller bills, and I won't go into detail. I'll just mention one of them. One of them, which was turned into, you wouldn't think it would be controversial, but it was a libraries bill, and it ended up having a provision in it that got controversial when we worked that out. It had to do with whether libraries would be able to directly obtain some of the money from the cannabis fund for after-school programs. And that turned out to be, it's like, this happens all the time. You think something pretty simple and all of a sudden it blows up out of nowhere. But we worked it out. It was just, but we wanted to make sure that the libraries got access to some of that money to run after-school programs. And we wanted to make sure it was available to some of the little libraries around Vermont, which is most of them. And it had been set up in a way that was just too onerous to get small amounts of money for libraries for whom it could do a lot of good. So anyway, we worked that one out. The important bill we got out over the last couple of weeks before crossover was a bill that deals with ICE showing up at the schoolhouse door. And to protect, we want, schools should absolutely be a place of sanctuary, a place where kids can go to school and know that they can go to school. And so what this does is sort of sets up a policy where ICE is not allowed in, and then what happens if they do it anyway, and then policies planned out in advance, contacts planned out in advance. So it's really making sure that schools are prepared and have thought through the details and sets up a system for that to happen. Normally, just the rule of thumb, at least for me, and I think a lot of people is, there's all kinds of great ideas we all have all the time for what schools should be doing. But if we start piling on, telling schools what to do, they actually end up not being able to do what they need to do. So the starting point is we don't tell, we let administrators run schools. But this is one time where everybody, I think even including schools, recognize that it would be better to, whatever extra work it takes to get this ready, it's going to be well worth it when the time comes that if it does happen. So that passed the Senate, I think a week ago or something like that. So the funny thing is, in both committees, after real weeks of real intensity at the end, then crossover hits. And there's a moment in time when you go, okay, what do we do now? Because it kind of, there's a little lull in between before the bills come over from the other body. But we, of course, have been working on the larger ed bill, the second step in the Act 73 process, and we can talk about that whenever we want to talk about it. But in the meantime, we got those bills out. We also have to work on our budget letter because most committees, there aren't the money committees, but have, like in education and natural resources, there's a whole lot of competition for dollars going on. And we try to help the appropriations committee at least know what our priorities are. And they still have to sort through. So we try to do triage, try to say, these are the most important couple of things that we think that need to happen, give it over to the appropriations committee, and then, then it's out of our hands. But that's on our list.
Excellent. Thank you. I appreciate that update, and we'll definitely be returning more to that larger education question. very shortly. Senator Plunkett, I'm curious from your perspective if you have been feeling any of that lull and what that experience has been like for you and what's been coming in through the crossover period. I think we ended yesterday's show with you letting us know that you were off to a weekend of reading.
Yes, yeah, and interestingly enough, a lot of those bills went to either appropriations or finance. So we haven't even brought them up on the floor yet, although we did go through quite a number of them this week. But yeah, the lull in committees was distinctly palpable. In fact, agriculture, I think we met once over the 4 days. We're looking forward to a number of the bills from Representative Durfee's committee, particularly a paraquat banning bill that we have on our wall, but there was a companion in the House, and I'm at least one of the sponsors on the bill on our wall. So digging into that is something I'm looking forward to. And folks probably don't know, but paraquat's a pesticide, if I recall correctly. It's not also an herbicide, is it, Dave? Well, regardless, it's used for in agriculture, but it's associated with Parkinson's disease, and many of the countries that produce it have banned it. So China produces it, exports it, but they can't use it in China. So that's an interesting one, although big, although relatively small, and I hope not controversial. In institutions, we are waiting for the I forget what exactly it's called, but it's the Capital Construction Adjustment Bill, I believe. And part of this is that what we passed last year in the capital bill, it's a 2-year bill. So now we're coming back and looking at it to adjust the prior bill, and we did go over what the initial recommendation from the administration was, but I'm not even going to try to dig into the details of it because, as Mary mentioned, it's amazing the range of different things that fall under that bill. And I was just looking at the spreadsheet that is in Mary's committee, and one of the Joint Fiscal Office folks, his name's Scott Moore. He puts together this beautiful spreadsheet that even those of us that have not done any sort of finance before can readily dig into. So, but that's very fun. So I'm looking forward to that. But we do have a couple of bills from corrections and institutions that are that we did start to dig into. And the first one is regarding supervision fees for those that are sentenced and aren't incarcerated. So that's folks on probation, folks on parole, folks on furlough. Right now, DOC can essentially charge these folks for their sentence when they're under supervision up to $30. And the House passed the bill striking that and also forgiving the outstanding debt for folks with that, which is not an insubstantial amount, but it's essentially bad debt that's never going to be collected. And I'm very supportive of that, and I was glad to see it come through because for years we had talked about how it doesn't make sense to punish someone and make them pay for their own punishment, but there were some reasons for it, and I believe it went into place in 2008. But we've now come to 2026 and realize that it's non-functioning. And we did get another parole board bill that I have not dug into, so we'll be digging into that. What we spent the past couple of weeks on is a bill that was not in our committee but was in judiciary, which is just sort of like briefly establishing what's called a forensic facility for those that are found not competent or not guilty by reason of insanity. And it's a very important but a very narrow bill, because this is only dealing with essentially the folks that are facing potential life in jail if they're either convicted or or if they were found not guilty by reason of insanity on one of those offenses, and they're also found by the court to be a significant danger to the public. But the portion of that is so there are two portions of that are important. So we've got folks, and there's one specifically in Bennington that I won't specifically name, but is someone who's over and over been in a clear danger in the way that our hospitalization system has functioned makes it clear that there's a clear gap in public safety when it comes to these sorts of folks. So that's part of it, and the other part is perhaps more important, where we're one of the few states that does not have a competency restoration program. So folks are found not competent to stand trial, but that's a status that can definitely change. And depending on the reason why they're not competent, it might be something as simple as we need to make sure that we have proper language instruction, or perhaps some other sort of like communications so that they can assist their attorney, so that they could come eventually have uh, uh, their time in court. So having that, and even if it's for this narrow group of folks, starting to establish that is important. And the reason our committee was looking at it is we deal with corrections as well. And the proposal is for the Department of Corrections to run these programs. And there's different debate on whether or not that's appropriate. And that's part of why we were looking at it. Ultimately, our committee seems, I believe we were all in agreement. There's going to be a couple of tweaks on the floor, but we are in agreement, and we'll be bringing that up next week, I believe, on the floor. I think it's on the notice calendar, and it's done with appropriations and finance. So we'll be dealing with that soon. But yes, other than that, that might have sounded like a lot that we talked about, but it did feel like quite the lull over the past couple of weeks, which was good for me because I did have the flu during town meeting week, and I was still recovering, so it was a little bit easier.
Excellent. And similar question for you, Representative Durfee. Obviously, you got to give us a more comprehensive update on your own committee's work in the last episode, but how that crossover experience has been and where things look like they're headed now that that's transpired.
Yeah, crossover for us came, but didn't actually go entirely. We had a bill that we passed, which would have been a week ago, at the crossover date of the 13th, with the understanding that that the bill needed more work, and that we were going to be working with another committee on an amendment. And a week later, we still don't have that amendment. And procedurally, what that's meant is that the bill showed up on our legislative calendar, but we postponed it. And so it's been pushed off now till next week. And whether we'll actually get to it next week or not is another question. But it's been sort of interesting insight into the way the rules work, so that, yeah, we do have a deadline, but in fact, there are ways to work around it, and this is one of them. So we'll see what happens with that. Senator Plunkett sort of stole my thunder on the one of our signature bills. We had passed out, and this may have come up last week too, I don't remember, but one of the bills that we did pass out was a ban on paraquat, which is a pesticide that is not widely used in Vermont, but it is used, and we're phasing that out. It's been linked to Parkinson's. So I'm glad to hear that the Senate Agriculture Committee is interested in taking it up as well. It was on the floor this week. It was voted out on a voice vote, I think unanimously. So that is a good sign. It had come out of our committee unanimously too. We had a pretty busy week on the floor. We had passed 6 bills last week. So with the exception of the one, they came up. One is the right to grow vegetable gardens, which seems like, do we not have that right already? specifically for renters and for residents of common interest communities, so homeowners associations or certain types of condominiums where where there are rules, and there's commonly owned land, but there may also be land that is yours to work on, but there might be rules about what you can do there. So we've uh, set up, given the tenant or the resident there, depending on the situation, uh, the right to grow some kinds of vegetables, and for eating, obviously. The food, our committee is agriculture and food resiliency and forestry, and what we're doing here is trying to make our food system more resilient so that people can grow their own food, that everybody can grow their own food. Um, the House passed a bill that will require baby food manufacturers and infant formula manufacturers to make available to the public testing results for heavy metals in their products. We know that, for example, lead is found in the environment, and uh, we know that no amount of lead is acceptable in our drinking water, and yet it's very difficult to remove it completely. And the same is true uh, in things that grow. So what might end up in baby food or in formula may have trace amounts of various heavy metals, and there are limits. There's testing done, but different products, different batches can have different levels of those metals. So this will allow a consumer to scan using a code that'll be a QR code that'll be printed on the label, and already is in some cases, will allow the consumer to go in and look and see, how much is in this batch, and what does a different brand have. So a parent or other caregiver can make an informed choice about those um, those levels of heavy metals. Uh, we did, as Senator Plunkett said, and Senator Bongart's also in this week, it's a bit of a lull. We're waiting for the bills to come over from the Senate. We got a bit of a head start. We took a look at what the bill is that we're probably going to get, and saw that there is a section on hemp and the regulation of hemp. So we took some preliminary testimony this week, and we'll dig into that more next week. But hemp and cannabis are easily confused, partly because they're essentially the same plant, and depending on the level of the psychoactive ingredient, THC, it's either a federally one or Schedule One, banned drug, or it's something that is still federally regulated but can be grown. And obviously, we know that there are federal laws that ban marijuana, but state laws now have changed across the country, um, and yet it's not quite cut and dried as far as what about products that aren't that we that you don't have to buy in a retail shop that's licensed for cannabis, but might have some CBD, for example, in them, and federal law is changing on that. So I know that the Senate looked at that, and we may be looking more specifically at what happens with those products that we've been able to buy over the past few years in retail grocery stores that may have some CBD in them, and may now be at risk due to new changes in the federal law. Otherwise, we had a busy week on the House floor. Appropriately, we had all passed out bills the previous week, and many of those bills, including ours, came up. So we had some long days this week on the House floor, and then next week we'll be digging more into the bills that have come over from the Senate.
Excellent. I appreciate that update from all of you, and we'll definitely keep tracking how all these bills are moving forward, and especially as the conference committees come together, where the resolutions between the House and the Senate side land. On that topic of maybe different ideas coming out of the House and the Senate, I do want to return to that conversation around the broader education reform that's going on and the work that is continuing around the provisions that Act 73 requested in terms of statewide education transformation. There have been proposals put forward, one by you, Senator Bongartz, from the Senate side, another one that's come from the House, that have slightly different visions for overall statewide consolidation. Currently, just for general reference, we have 119 districts and 52 governing bodies in the current education system. The proposal that you put forward, Senator Bongartz, has 11 supervisory unions, and I would like to hear you describe that proposal in a little more detail and how that functions. And then that proposal has now been in conversation with the proposal that's come forward from the House side, which looks for 27 supervisory districts. And so if you could talk a little bit about where your proposal sits, where that House proposal sits, and what the path forward is between those two visions for this reimagining of the education system.
So my every sense is that the House version that you described is dead, is not going anywhere. And what the House is looking at now is some kind of a shared services agreement. So what the Senate version does is, as we know, that for the foundation formula to work, there has to be some. It works better with larger districts, and so what we're looking to do is just, in some ways, is simple and practical. It's simply to reduce the number of SUs, those 52 that you were talking about, by about half, and reducing the number of districts from 119 to 60 or 59, 60, and set up a process for that to happen voluntarily for 2 years. And I think, by the way, that it will happen largely within those 2 years, because there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. There's a lot of easy mergers of districts. And then if that doesn't happen, we're developing criteria for the state board to close the gap down to get us to the 50%. Largely, probably the most important single criterion would be size of districts and trying to get them to increase in size a little bit. So it's not trying to do more than that. It is simply trying to reduce the number of SUs and reduce the number of districts, do it largely voluntarily or through an organic process. But then the foundation formula will work much better. And my own sense is that we actually may have more mergers than that, because districts will recognize on their own that it makes sense to merge with the foundation formula coming into being in FY30. And the other thing that we did that's in this draft, the most current draft of the bill, is to raise the base amount from it was 15,033, but since then, and then that 15,033 is then theoretically, even though the foundational formula is not in place, multiplied by the NEPA index, which is similar to CPI, but has different factors. What has happened in the 2 years, and so everything was tied to 2024, that's where the 15,033 came from. And, but if we don't adjust that base, given that we've had effectively statewide 5.5% and 5.5% increases over the last 2 years, when the foundation formula hit, we'd have a cliff. And so what we've done is multiplied the 15,033 times effectively. It's actually 5.3 1 year or something like that, but effectively 5.5 and then 5.5, and come up with a new base amount of 16,780. And that will, and then everything would tie from that in the 26, as in 26. So we wouldn't have a cliff when the foundation formula comes into being. So we've done that. Now, what the finance committee will do with that, I don't know. If nothing else, it's a placeholder saying, but you should really look at this because we don't want to have a cliff. So That's our bill is actually that simple. We're not trying, and then, to the extent that things like BOCES or Seesaw is the next level, that might make sense to do this the next year after we've begun to get some of the mergers, and that can get layered on top. We decided just to keep it simple, reduce the number of SUs, reduce the number of districts, get it over to the finance committee, and then over to the House. So that's where we are.
And I want to go over to you for some reflection on that, Representative Morrissey, since you've gone through one of these education transformations before. You've mentioned that it was around the time that you were joining the House that one of the major transformations has happened. Your reflections on this, the timeline for it, and the vision for it.
Well, as I have said, and I don't say it just to, put a statement out there, but this, as we all know, has to be very carefully and thoughtfully done because there are consequences if it's not done well, and we have seen some obviously from the Act 60 that started off well intentioned, but just is now not sustainable. But again, most importantly, we need to look at how obviously we can provide a quality education for our students, and the different complexities within a system. Anything from, you will sometimes hear the different parts of education, like it'll be said, well, special education needs more money because of sometimes the complexity of the different issues that students may have within special ed. And we've talked about where we haven't done any school building. I think our middle school was one of the last buildings or schools that was helped to be built by, with state funding. That's all been on a moratorium. So there are the concerns with that, but the districting, and maybe Seth can explain I was trying to review the what had come from the Senate Education, and I wasn't fully sure how the districts and the supervisory union districts they almost appeared to be different, and how different those would be depending upon who is or what townships are placed within those two kind of models. And maybe that's something that if we have time that Seth could possibly explain to me, so I have a better understanding. But there are complexities within this that we need to, for not only our students but our teachers. And this week there was a large group in the State House for school choice, and some of our private schools, which, the North Shire and South Shire and throughout our Bennington County has some of, of the private schools as well. And how do you blend this together to be, respectfully providing the education for our students, because it's not one size fits all for every student. And, that's why, this isn't an easy, an easy lift. And then financially looking at how you're going to pay for it. So, at this point of the session, I have concerns that every week we're hearing different proposals, and I know that the committees are trying to work hard and sort out the priorities within, each bill, but it is hard as a member who's not on the education committee to be getting bits and pieces and not have kind of a form of a bill at this point to really try to go through and evaluate, what works for your region or township. But also we all have to, be respectful to think of all the other townships and districts in the state, because it has to be there is the equity issue in providing an equal education for our students, and how do we do that. So this has been a challenging time, for education, and we have met, and the members who were on this show will, tell you that, our supervisory union, we have met pretty much on a monthly or as needed basis with the superintendent and some other like other entities or schools within our region here have come to these meetings, and to provide their input as well. But I'm hoping that we get to the point fairly soon of actually seeing a bill that we can get our arms around and really look to see what would work and what would not work. And again, there will be many different opinions on that, as there normally is and should be. But again, we've got to focus very carefully on what is best for educating our students and having the resources and supporting teachers in the process, and families with the needs for our children.
And I do want to bring two of those points back to you, Senator Bongartz, both about how the supervisory unions and districts interact with each other, because I think that's, definitely something that people just generally, I think, have questions about, and it can be hard to understand or challenging to untangle even when you're first familiarizing yourself with the education system. And then also that question of independent schools, where they sit within any of these proposed plans for greater consolidation and the attempt to reach a different kind of funding formula for public education.
So maybe just in slightly reverse order, the last year the number of independent schools was reduced by more than half. And so there are 18 independent schools, and that issue was kind of settled. That was settled last year. So we have 18 independent schools within the system. We have to make the system, they're part of the system. They always have been part of the system, and they continue to be. So the we are always going to, and so, but by the way, there's no attempt to expand choice. That there was that rally at the State House, but that's just not in the cards, and for all kinds of reasons. And we've had a system with kids that involved in independent schools. The vast majority of them are at the 4 historic academies, and they've always been a key part of the system. In fact, the system can't function without them. So, and just to back up one step, it's worth reminding everybody about this. We absolutely must bend the cost curve. The current system has been generating, double-digit increases year after year. People can't pay their property taxes. We had the kind of property tax revolt in 2024. Understandably, actually. So we have to get something in place and we can't continue to buy down the rate, by the way, which we've also been doing for the last several years. I think everybody, we do it, but we know it's bad policy because it makes it worse the next year. And we're using money that we can't use for housing or whatever else, or primary care, or all kinds of other things we could be using that money for as we try. So that's not sustainable. So we must fix the system, and we must bring down the rate of increase to a predictable level. So the one of the realities of life is that the House version the map that you first referenced had only supervisory districts in it, and the problem with supervisory districts is that within supervisory districts, by definition, all constructs must be the same. And supervisory unions allow for districts that operate differently. Like they might not operate at all in some parts of the SU, and they might have elementary schools in some parts. That's Essex County, by the way. In particular, the islands are the same way. They don't have any high schools, so their kids all tuition. So as we have taken testimony from around the state, it's very clear that there's no chance under the sun of passing a bill that doesn't have SUs. And SUs allow, as Mary referenced, the terminology of one size does not fit all. SUs allow for a system that has differences within it, but that achieves the goals. And so the bill that we're putting together in the Senate has actually 12 SUs. You were right when you said 11 because it used to have 11, but it's gotten moved to 12. And partially by recognizing that Bennington County was going to be by far the largest SU. And so and everybody's now around 2,700 in that range. And so we divided Bennington County. I heard a lot of discussion about this, and it was too big. And so we kind of went back to the way that Bennington County is set now, and it brings the number to 12. But so I think that it is a little confusing because there's a lot of the state has supervisory districts, which are really supervisory unions with only one district. That's the way to think about them. Supervisory unions, as we think about them, tend to have multiple districts in them. So the SDs are really supervisory unions, but there's only one district. So, and those tend to be focused around Chittenden County, not just in Chittenden County, but around Chittenden County. There's a big block of SDs, and they work for them. And so there's no attempt to change that. And so we have a system where we're trying to reduce that area of the map around Chittenden County, reduce that number by about half, and then do the same thing with the rest of the state. So that's what we're trying to do. And if we can accomplish that, and again, largely voluntarily, it will make the foundation formula work much better. And my own view is that We have to have something like the foundation formula in place, or we're going to the current path is absolutely not sustainable. Even though we did reduce budgets this year, which was great actually, but we are on a curve. We are on a curve that is absolutely unsustainable, and we have to fix it. We have to figure out. I'm My committee, I think, is looking for a very practical, not even that, not very threatening approach that allows this to happen organically. And again, there's so much low hanging fruit of obvious district mergers that I think it will happen, if not entirely on its own, almost entirely on its own within that 2 year period.
Excellent. There's plenty more for us to dig into here. Much more than we'll be able to cover just today. So we'll definitely be returning to this and may indeed dedicate an entire show to some of this as it becomes, to Representative Morrissey's point, as there are concrete proposals and bills coming forward. Definitely something that we'll dig into the minutia of in more detail. Before we wrap up today, I did also want to follow up on something that we discussed last week, which is the immigration enforcement action that happened up in South Burlington and how the aftermath of that has played out both on a community level, but also within the legislature. So, as a reminder for folks, federal immigration enforcement officials in South Burlington had a criminal warrant for an individual. The enforcement action that then actually resulted in the detention of 3 other people who were not named in the warrant, all of whom have since been released from detention as of this week. The third person was released on Friday, and so this past week on Thursday there was a hearing with the legislature. There was some criticism that that hearing only included law enforcement officials. It didn't include community voices, any of the activists or those who were um, present and experiencing the enforcement action. It was really digging into the actions of law enforcement and reflections from law enforcement officials on how the incident itself played out, where many community members, uh, when they were alerted to the federal immigration enforcement action, converged on the location and attempted, in some cases with their physical presence, to obstruct the federal immigration officials from actually entering a home in which the 3 people who ended up being detained were sheltering at that time. Um, and during a significant portion of the day, one of their children was also within the home. So I want to hear a little more about how that hearing played out and some of the reflections on the ways. One of the major questions was the ways that state and local law enforcement had interacted with federal immigration enforcement officials to kind of accomplish whatever the goals may have been of their enforcement action. And a lot of the questions revolved around the state's fair and impartial policing policy. So, just as a little context for folks, a couple of relevant passages from that policy before we get into the conversation. In the more general language at the beginning of the policy, it states enforcement of civil immigration law is a federal responsibility, and agencies should not engage in such enforcement except as otherwise outlined in this policy. And then Section 5 of the Fair and Impartial Policing Policy is state/local law enforcement authority/priorities and federal immigration law. A couple of pieces from that, which were sort of at the center of this conversation, um, are the portion that reads, "The trust and cooperation of immigrant communities is essential to prevent and solve crimes and maintain the safety and security of all. The U.S. Constitution's Fourth Amendment and Vermont Constitution's Article 11 rights against unreasonable search and seizure apply equally to all individuals in Vermont." And then the 2 subsections there say that, and this is a model policy, so these are, this names specific agencies when it's adopted, but it says agency members do not have authority to enforce federal civil immigration law. Mere presence in the United States without authorization, for example, residing in the country with an expired visa, is a civil violation and may not be subject to investigation. And the next section reads, though agency members have authority to enforce federal criminal law, enforcement of federal criminal immigration law is generally not a priority for the agency. Accordingly, agency members should not make warrantless arrests, detain individuals, facilitate the detention of individuals, or otherwise expend resources investigating or enforcing unlawful entry or unlawful reentry cases unless such actions are: 1, necessary to ensure public safety or officer safety, imminent risk of physical injury or subject officer or third party, or 2, integral to the investigation of criminal offenses unrelated to immigration law. And then in the additional restrictions section of that fair and impartial policing policy, it says that agencies shall not accept requests by federal immigration authorities to support or assist in civil immigration enforcement. So a lot of the questions that have come out of the events that transpired in South Burlington are around whether or not some of the actions taken by state police and local law enforcement officials may or may not violate some of the provisions of this policy based on how the complex events on the ground played out in real time. I'll bring it over to you first, Representative Durfee, for reflections on that hearing that took place on Thursday and just generally how this is sort of being digested as more information about what happened in South Burlington comes out and these questions are being addressed.
Yeah, I will just say that in all honesty, I only know that hearing took place, Jack, because I read about it through in the news media. And I think that's maybe just an illustration of how we are uh, when we're in Montpelier, we're focused on the things that we're focused on. And often those interact immediately with what's happening in the outside world, and often they don't. I Senator Plunkett is probably better positioned to speak to the legal aspects of the question, and I believe, and again, this is only inferring from the news article I read, that this was a Senate hearing, maybe Senate Judiciary, although it may have been a joint hearing. But in any case, I was glad to see that the hearing took place, glad to read that. Um, a little disturbed by some of what I read. Um, I don't know what is intended to happen next, but I think that certainly shining a light on the question and doing so right away uh, was it was a good thing. And beyond that, I don't really know. I I'm gonna just break with protocol here briefly, Jack, because I know we've moved on, but I wanted to say just a thought that I wanted to air regarding education, if I might. Uh, I'm increasingly pessimistic that we are going to get anything done this year. And that's despite the fact that the governor has threatened to veto the budget bill, the big budget bill, if we don't. It's I think just a question of very entrenched vested interests and different interests that are going to make it hard, despite best intentions. And I completely agree with Seth that we need to uh, that a foundation formula or a way of bending the cost curve, which is the expression we use for not spending less, but stop increasing so much every year what we're spending, that has to happen. But I am wondering increasingly whether that's even going to be possible. And if not this year, with so much attention on it, and the governor putting, taking it, drawing a line in the sand, whether that's even now that's going to happen. So anyway, apologies for going out of order there, but
That is totally fine. It is excellent to have your reflections on that as well, and a valuable perspective, and certainly we'll be following up on whether or not action actually does take place and how perhaps similar to last year, the legislative session is extended because of the question around education. I do, before we wrap up, want to bring it over to you, Senator Plunkett, as our resident lawyer and prosecutor
Yeah.
for some follow up on these questions around what has transpired in South Burlington and how that is kind of playing out in its aftermath with these questions of how federal immigration enforcement actions do dovetail with some of the state law and how that plays out in real time when this becomes a question of what's happening in communities.
Yeah, and so because the law and my agriculture committee, I was able to be at the hearing. It was a joint hearing. Chair Hashim, this of Senate Judiciary, he ran the meeting, but he organized it with Chair Lalonde of House Judiciary, and there was at the time criticism about essentially the voices that were heard, but this wasn't really a hearing to hear voices. It was really a hearing to have law enforcement answer for their for their actions, and that was the initial intent. And Chair Hashim and actually the Senate Democrats had been discussing that very evening of having the same folks come in the next day. It's quite clear that they wouldn't have answers right away, and so it was. I don't want to say postponed, but it was scheduled for, I believe it was 8 days later, and then we had. There could be a lot to say about this, so I'll try to do it as briefly as possible. But we had Burlington, South Burlington, VSP, and also the commissioner of the Department of Public Safety, and the disappointment I felt to begin with was that they did have 8 days and essentially said, we're still looking at everything. And I understand that after action evaluations, and indeed looking at anything involved with these types of events can take a long time. But it was something where I wanted to have a lot more specifics and hear a lot more from the folks that were actually there. None of the folks that spoke, except for, I believe, I might be wrong about this. I know the chief of South Burlington was there. The chief of Burlington, I don't know if he was there or not. So ultimately, there was a lot of sort of the expected defensiveness that you would get from law enforcement. I was disappointed because having worked with law enforcement for so long, they are used to having their split seconds decisions questioned over and over again, after someone's able to watch the video 5 million times. And it feels unfair when that happens because they're making split second decisions. But that's the part of the job. And I didn't expect, especially from the chief of Burlington, to hear such defensiveness and to have it be something where it was clear that he was blaming a group that he called agitators that perhaps was not warranted. The South Burlington chief of police said a few things that were quite heartening to me, actually. And he didn't say it in this way, but it was very clear that his concern was that the federal agents were going to hurt protesters. And he wanted to prevent someone's death. And so that was heartening. It was also heartening to hear that the special agent in charge of HSI was part of the conversation and had tried to dissuade it's ICE ERO, and I forget what ERO stands for, enforcement removal operations or something. Tried to dissuade them, and that those folks weren't local. Those folks were from out of state, which was something new that I had not heard before, and that at least our local and the different alphabet agencies, it's all complicated, but we don't want to go into that. But it was heartening that our local federal folks were trying to dissuade it. There are two things that I was deeply disturbed by, and one of them came from Colonel Birmingham, and I'm hoping that he gets a chance to explain it a later time, and the other was from Commissioner Morrison. I'll start with Commissioner Morrison, where the question was essentially, what internal investigations are going on. And I'm just going to say internal investigations because there are different layers of different complaints. And what I heard from her was that we got a lot of these that were anonymous, and so therefore we cannot investigate. That was something that I know, at least in my role, is not necessarily true. They can be investigated. They are, however, going to be looking through all of the body cameras, putting together a timeline. So perhaps that'll be fleshed out a little bit more. The other thing was from Colonel Birmingham regarding when local law enforcement sees federal law enforcement using excessive force, what can they do? And essentially, the sense that I got was nothing can be done. It should be referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and that was something that I was shocked to hear. in part because, and I don't have all of the facts on this, and I'm withholding final judgment on all of this because I don't know a lot of the facts. I've just heard what's been there. But one of the things was that when ICE was trying to retrieve one of their vehicles, there was a single officer, ICE officer, behind the wheel, started to drive, started to move forward, and there was a protester underneath the wheel, and a trooper was stopping that officer from going forward and had to first yell at him to stop, which he did not, and then punch the window. And I don't know if it was punching out the window or if it was just getting the driver's attention. And I hear that, and I think that that is use of deadly force against another human being, and it may very well be criminal. And local law enforcement can investigate that and should. And so that was something that I was disturbed to hear, and I hope that there's further explanation for that. But what I'm also heartened by is what Chair Hashim's um, uh, intent was to try to put local law or put law enforcement or state law enforcement their feet to the fire at this hearing, and then have a much broader public hearing where we'll hear from the folks that were there, and have them have their say, and have that at a time when it's convenient for most people, and probably for a much longer period of time. I think we had maybe 2 hours. I'm guessing that the later public hearing will be longer. So that's really a very short sort of my impression for that. In the room, we obviously had the two judiciary committees. We had from the Senate side, Senator Rom Hinsdale was there, Senator Hardy was there, myself were there. So, and this, I'm not saying that any folks should have been there, but I'd hope to see a lot more legislators. I did see Molly Gray, who's a candidate for lieutenant governor, but I wanted that room to be filled with legislators, and it was mostly not. So be that as it may, but I don't know to what degree there's a lot of real discussion in Montpelier about it, in part because of the timing. We were, the House is definitely busy on the floor, and the Senate side had our different sorts of things. So I'm hoping that this will not stop, and we'll keep going. We'll hear a lot more from those folks.
Thank you very much for those reflections, and certainly something that we'll be keeping an eye on and looking for further hearings and further outcomes from this initial discussion with local and state law enforcement. I want to thank you all for your time this morning, and we will return to these topics and many others in future episodes of In Session.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you, Jack.